Miss Marple's worn gloves. They covered more than cold hands. Chapter 1. The Frayed Edges. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cosy sitting room in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate shadows on the worn oak table. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warmth a gentle counterpoint to the October chill seeping through the window panes. Miss Marple sat in her favourite armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue scarf. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, occasionally flicked toward the window, where the village bustled quietly beyond. Her knitting basket, a wicker relic from her youth, sat at her feet, overflowing with skeins of wool, a pair of scissors, and the odd thimble. As she reached for a new ball of yarn, her fingers brushed against something unexpected. A pair of gloves, tucked beneath a tangle of thread. She paused, her needles still, and drew them out with the care one might afford a fragile relic. The gloves were old, their once fine leather softened by years of use. The stitching along the edges was fraying, threads curling like tendrils seeking escape. They were small, clearly made for a woman's hands, with a faint embossing of initials, too worn to decipher, near the cuff. Miss Marple turned them over, her brow furrowing slightly. They were not hers, she was certain of that. Her own gloves, practical and plain, were folded neatly in a drawer upstairs. "Curious," she murmured, her voice barely louder than the fire's crackle. She held the gloves closer, inspecting them under the light of a nearby lamp. The leather was scuffed at the fingertips, as though their owner had gripped something tightly, repeatedly. A faint stain marred the palm of the right glove. Ink, perhaps, or something less benign. Miss Marple's lips pursed. She had not had visitors in days, save for young Lucy, who had brought a basket of apples from the vicarage orchard. Lucy's hands were bare, her fingers sticky with fruit juice, not leather-clad. The gloves felt, heavy with implication, as though they carried the weight of a story untold. Miss Marple set them on the table, smoothing them flat. St. Mary Mead was a quiet village, its scandals often small. A misplaced letter, a whispered affair. But she knew better than most that even the smallest thread could unravel a tapestry of secrets. She rose, her movements deliberate, and crossed to the window. The village green was emptying as dusk settled, shopkeepers locking their doors, children scampering home. Her gaze lingered on the post office, where Mrs. Clement was sweeping the stoop. Had someone left the gloves during a fleeting visit? Or had they been placed in her basket deliberately? A silent plea or a subtle challenge? The clock on the mantel chimed 5, pulling her from her thoughts. Tea would wait. She returned to the gloves, slipping them into a small paper bag for safekeeping. Tomorrow she would begin her inquiries, discreetly of course. A word with Mrs. Clement, perhaps, or a visit to the vicarage. Someone in St. Mary Mead knew these gloves, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. As she resumed her knitting, the needles moving with their familiar rhythm, her mind was already at work, tugging at the frayed edges of a mystery that felt far larger than a pair of forgotten gloves. Chapter 2. Threads of Suspicion. The following morning, Miss Marple's cottage was fragrant with the scent of freshly brewed tea and scones cooling on a rack. She had invited a small group for tea, a carefully chosen handful of St. Mary Meads, residents whose tongues she knew might loosen over a cup of Darjeeling. The gloves, still tucked in their paper bag, rested out of sight in a drawer. but their presence loomed in her mind like an unanswered question. The sitting room was bright, the fire stoked to ward off the autumn chill. Mrs. Clement, the postmistress, perched on the edge of a chintz-covered chair, her hands fidgeting with a lace handkerchief. Beside her sat Miss Hartnell, whose sharp eyes missed little, and whose opinions missed even less. Young Lucy from the vicarage balanced a teacup with practised grace, while Mr. Pye, the local antique dealer, leaned back with an air of amused detachment, his polished shoes gleaming. "Such a dreadful chill this morning," Miss Hartnell remarked, her voice cutting through the clink of china. "I told Mrs. Price she'll catch her death if she doesn't wear proper gloves." Miss Marple's ears pricked at the word, though her expression remained placid as she poured tea. "Gloves are so essential this time of year," she said mildly, "though I find some pairs carry more character than others." Mrs. Clement's handkerchief twisted tighter. "Character," she echoed, her tone a shade too bright. "Oh, I suppose old things do. Like those letters we get at the post office, all creased and stained." "Stained, you say?" Miss Marple's eyes flicked to her, gentle but probing. "I came across a curious pair of gloves myself recently. Worn leather, a bit frayed. Not mine, I'm afraid, but they've a story, I think." The room stilled for a fraction of a second, or perhaps Miss Marple only imagined it. Lucy's teacup clattered softly against its saucer. Mr. Pye's smile tightened, his fingers brushing the cuff of his tailored coat. Miss Hartnell, oblivious, launched into a tale of her own lost mittens. But Miss Marple's attention lingered on the others. Mrs. Clement's gaze darted to the window, as though the village green held answers. "People leave things about," she said quickly. "Coats, scarves, gloves. You'd be surprised what turns up at the post office." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, passing a plate of scones. "And yet these gloves feel particular, as though they were left for a reason." Lucy coughed, a small nervous sound. "Perhaps they belong to someone who visited recently." She offered, her cheeks pink. "The vicarage has had so many callers lately, with the harvest festival planning." Mr. Pye leaned forward, his voice smooth. "Or they're simply a relic, Miss Marple. You know how St. Mary Mead clings to its odds and ends. Why, I found a silver locket in a shop crate last week. No owner, no provenance. Just a pretty thing with secrets." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Secrets, Mr. Pye? How intriguing. I do think gloves, like lockets, might cover more than they seem." The conversation shifted to harvest festival gossip, but Miss Marple noted every glance, every pause. Mrs. Clement's handkerchief was nearly a knot. Lucy's fingers trembled as she reached for a scone. Mr. Pye's nonchalance felt practised, his eyes too keen on the room's corners. Miss Hartnell, bless her, prattled on, unaware of the undercurrent. As her guests departed, Miss Marple stood at the door, waving them off into the crisp air. The gloves, she thought, had stirred something, a ripple in the village's calm surface. She would visit the post office tomorrow, perhaps, and ask Mrs. Clement about those creased and stained letters. For now, she returned to her sitting room, the fire still warm, and opened the drawer. The gloves lay there, frayed and silent, but their threads of suspicion were already weaving a pattern only she could see. Chapter 3. The Stain. That lingers, the morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a soft grey veil. Miss Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl, stepped briskly along the cobbled path towards the post office. The gloves, safely tucked in her handbag, seemed to pulse with quiet urgency. Their faint stain, ink, blood, or something else entirely, had kept her awake, her mind turning over possibilities like a spindle spinning thread. The post office was a small, cluttered space, its counter strewn with stamps and parcels. Mrs. Clement stood behind it, sorting letters with a distracted air. Her eyes widened slightly as Miss Marple entered, the bell above the door jingling. "Good morning, Mrs. Clement," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but laced with purpose. "I thought I might trouble you about those letters you mentioned yesterday, the creased and stained ones." Mrs. Clement's hands faltered, a letter slipping from her fingers. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's nothing really," she said too quickly. "Just old post, you know. People drop things off or they pile up in the back." Miss Marple smiled, setting her handbag on the counter. "Of course, but I've always thought letters, like gloves, carry such stories. I found a pair recently, you see, with a curious stain. It made me wonder about other overlooked items." Mrs. Clement's gaze flicked to the handbag, then away. "Gloves, you said? I don't recall any. But stains? Well, ink gets everywhere here. Spilled a bottle just last week." Her laugh was brittle, like glass on the verge of cracking. "Ink, perhaps," Miss Marple mused, her fingers brushing the handbag's clasp, though this stain seemed stubborn, almost deliberate. She paused, watching Mrs. Clement's face. "Have you had many strangers posting letters lately? Or perhaps someone sending things they'd rather not explain?" The postmistress busied herself with a stack of envelopes, her movements jerky. "Strangers? Oh no, just the usual folk, though." She hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice dropping. "There was a woman a fortnight ago, dropped off a parcel, no return address." Her hands were shaking, and she kept looking over her shoulder. "Paid in cash, and left before I could ask her name." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her tone remained gentle. "How curious. Did she wear gloves by chance?" Mrs. Clement frowned, thinking, I don't recall. It was a busy day, but she had a scarf, dark green, pulled tight around her face. Odd for such a mild morning." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. "And the parcel? Did it go through?" "Sent it off to London, I think," Mrs. Clement said, her voice steadier now. "Nothing unusual, just heavy. Books, maybe." She turned to a ledger, as if eager to change the subject. "Would you like stamps, Miss Marple, or are you posting something?" "Not today," Miss Marple said, smiling, "but I may return if I find more stray items." She bid Mrs. Clement goodbye and stepped back into the mist, her mind alight with new threads. The post office had yielded more than she'd hoped. A mysterious woman, a parcel with no sender, a trembling hand, each a stitch in the pattern forming around the gloves. The stain, she thought, was no mere accident. It clung to the leather like a memory, pointing to something, or someone, hidden in plain sight. As she walked home, Miss Marple glanced at the village green, where children played and shopkeepers chatted. St. Mary Mead seemed unchanged, its surface serene, but beneath it she sensed a current, dark and restless, tied to the gloves and the secrets they held. Tomorrow she would visit the seamstress, whose skilled hands might know the gloves' delicate embroidery. For now, She tightened her shawl and let the mist guide her home, the stain's shadow lingering in her thoughts. Chapter 4. Cold Hands, Warm Lies. The sun broke through the morning mist as Miss Marple made her way to the edge of St. Mary Mead, where Mrs. Finch, the village seamstress, kept her modest shop. The gloves nestled in their paper bag within her handbag felt like a silent companion, their delicate embroidery a clue she could no longer ignore. The intricate stitching, tiny roses entwined with a faint thread of silver, suggested a skilled hand, and Mrs. Finch was the only one in the village whose needlework matched such finesse. The shop was a cosy clutter of fabric bolts, spools of thread, and half-finished garments pinned to mannequins. A bell tinkled as Miss Marple entered, and Mrs. Finch looked up from her work table, her spectacles perched low on her nose. She was a wiry woman, her fingers nimble despite years of stitching, but her smile was guarded, as though she sensed the visit was more than social. "Good morning, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair near the counter. "I've been admiring some embroidery lately, and thought you might help me identify its maker." Mrs. Finch's needle paused mid-stitch, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Embroidery, you say? I do plenty, but so do others. What's it like?" Miss Marple opened her handbag and carefully withdrew the gloves, laying them on the table. The embroidered roses caught the light, their silver threads glinting. "These caught my eye. Not mine, I'm afraid, but the work is exquisite. Yours, perhaps." Finch's face tightened, her fingers curling around the needle. "No, not mine," she said, her voice clipped. "I'd remember work like that. Roses aren't my style, too fussy." She pushed her spectacles up, avoiding the gloves as though they might bite. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was sharp. "Of course, though you must see all sorts of needlework. Anyone in the village fond of roses? Or perhaps a customer from out of town?" Mrs. Finch busied herself with a length of muslin, her movements brisk. "Can't say I keep track. People bring in their mending. I stitch it, they leave. I don't ask questions." She glanced at a drawer beneath the counter, its lock glinting faintly, then back at Miss Marple. "Why the fuss over gloves? Lost property?" "Something like that," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "They were in my knitting basket of all places. Odd, don't you think? As though someone wanted them found." The seamstress's lips pressed into a thin line. "People are careless," she muttered. "Leave things everywhere. Like that woman last month, always dropping her pins. Clumsy sort, nervous too." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Nervous? How so?" Mrs. Finch hesitated, her fingers twitching. "Just jumpy. Came in for a hem, kept looking out the window like she expected trouble. Wore a dark scarf, green maybe, paid and left in a hurry." She shrugged, but her eyes darted to the locked drawer again. "A green scarf," Miss Marple echoed, her memory stirring. The mysterious woman from the post office, perhaps. Did she mention gloves or embroidery? "No," Mrs. Finch said too quickly. "Nothing like that. Just a hem." She stood, smoothing her apron. "I've got a dress to finish, Miss Marple. If you need more, I'll think on it, but I doubt I'll recall much." Miss Marple rose, slipping the gloves back into her handbag. "You've been most helpful, Mrs. Finch. I'll let you get back to your work." She smiled, but her eyes lingered on the locked drawer as she left. Outside, the village hummed with its usual rhythm But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. Mrs. Finch's denial had been too firm, her glances too telling. The locked drawer held something. Patterns, perhaps, or records of customers who preferred anonymity. And the nervous woman with the green scarf was no coincidence. The gloves' embroidery, like their stain, pointed to a truth buried beneath. Warm lies. As she walked home, Miss Marple resolved to keep an eye on Mrs. Finch. The seamstress knew more than she'd let on, and the gloves with their silent roses were tugging her closer to a secret that refused to stay hidden. Chapter 5. The Shadow in the Stitch. The afternoon light filtered through the ancient windows of St. Mary Mead's village hall, where Miss Marple sat at a long oak table, surrounded by dusty ledgers and yellowed documents. The gloves still in, their paper bag rested in her handbag at her side, their embroidered roses now a beacon guiding her deeper into the mystery. Mrs. Finch's guarded demeanour had confirmed the embroidery's significance, and a closer inspection of the gloves that morning had revealed a subtle pattern within the roses, a crest, faint but unmistakable, woven into the silver threads. It was no ordinary design, and Miss Marple suspected it tied to a family of note, perhaps one long faded from the village's memory. The village archives, kept in a musty corner of the hall, were her next step. Miss Marple had charmed Mr. Giles, the elderly clerk, with a plate of homemade biscuits, securing his help in navigating the records. He shuffled now among the shelves, muttering about misfiled deeds as he pulled out a heavy volume labelled Estates and Lineages, 1800-1900. "You're after something specific, Miss Marple?" Mr. Giles asked, wiping dust from his glasses. "These old families, they're mostly gone. Sold up or died out." "A crest, Mr. Giles," she said, her voice soft but precise. "A shield with a rose at its centre, perhaps with crossed branches. I saw it in some needlework and thought it might belong to one of St. Mary Mead's older families." He frowned, flipping through brittle pages. "Rose and shield. Sounds like the Haverfords, maybe. They had land here once, big manor up by the ridge. Fell on hard times, though. House burned down in 85, and the last of 'em left soon after." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her handbag. "The Haverfords," she repeated. "What became of them?" Mr. Giles scratched his chin, scanning a page. "Not much here. Old Sir Edmund Haverford died in the fire, they said. His daughter Clara was the last. She married and moved away. London, I think. No children, far as I know. The estate was sold off in bits. Sad business." "Sad indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her mind racing. The glove's crest, with its rose and shield, matched Mr. Giles's description too closely to be coincidence. But why would a Haverford heirloom end up in her knitting basket decades after the family's departure? She leaned forward, peering at the ledger. Is there anything about Clara's marriage, or where she went? Mr. Giles turned another page, his finger tracing faded ink. "Says here she married a Mr. Rowland Tate, a merchant. They left for London in 86. Nothing else, though—" He squinted, tilting the book. "There's a note about a dispute, something about a missing will. Sir Edmund's, maybe, never settled." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A missing will, a burned manor, a crest on a pair of gloves. The threads were weaving a shadow she could almost grasp. Might there be records of the Haverford estate elsewhere? Deeds, perhaps, or letters? "Could be," Mr. Giles said, closing the ledger. "The county office in Much Benham keeps duplicates, or the vicarage might have parish records. The Haverfords were churchgoers back in the day." "Thank you, Mr. Giles," Miss Marple said, rising with a smile. "You've been most helpful. I'll take my biscuits back if you've had your fill." He chuckled, waving her off, and she stepped into the crisp afternoon air, her thoughts alight. The Haverford crest tied the gloves to a family whose history was marred by loss and mystery. Clara Haverford, now Clara Tate, might hold answers if she still lived, and the nervous woman with the green scarf, mentioned by both Mrs. Clement and Mrs. Finch, seemed a living link to the gloves' journey. As she walked toward home, Miss Marple glanced at the ridge where the Haverford Manor once stood. Its ruins were long overgrown, but the gloves' stitches cast a shadow that reached across decades. Tomorrow she would visit the vicarage, seeking parish records or whispers of the Haverfords' final days. For now, the gloves remained her guide, their crest a silent promise of truths yet to be uncovered. Chapter 6. Whispers Under Wool. The St. Mary Mead Church Bazaar was in full swing, its stalls brimming with homemade jams, knitted scarves, and polished bric-a-brac. The air carried the scent of mulled cider and the hum of cheerful chatter. But Miss Marple moved through the crowd with a purpose sharper than the autumn breeze. The gloves, tucked safely in her handbag, had led her from the Haverford crest to a growing web of connections, and the bazaar offered a chance to observe the village's pulse and its secrets. She paused at a stall piled high with woolen goods, her eyes scanning the crowd. The Haverford mystery lingered in her thoughts, but so did the nervous woman with the green scarf, a figure now tied to both the post office and Mrs. Finch's shop. The bazaar, with its mix of locals and visitors, was the perfect place to catch a glimpse of her or someone else whose unease might betray a link to the gloves. "Miss Marple, do try my lavender sachets," called Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, from a nearby stall. Her smile was warm, but her hands fidgeted with a stack of embroidered handkerchiefs, their stitches simple compared to the gloves' intricate roses. "Lovely work, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, approaching with a smile, "though I've been admiring some finer embroidery lately. Roses with a touch of silver. Reminds me of old family crests." Mrs. Price's smile faltered, her fingers brushing a handkerchief. "Roses? Oh, I don't bother with anything so fancy. You'd want Mrs. Finch for that." Her eyes darted toward the crowd, where a figure in a dark coat lingered near the cider stall. Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting the figure's hurried movements. "Perhaps," she said lightly, "though I wonder if someone else in the village has a knack for such work. A visitor, maybe, or someone passing through." Mrs. Price hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice low. "There was a woman here earlier, buying wool. Kept her scarf up. Green it was, like she didn't want to be seen. Asked about old patterns. Said she was making something for a relative. Seemed anxious." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but her expression remained serene. "Anxious? How curious. Did she say where she was from?" "No, just paid and left," Mrs. Price said, straightening. "Didn't even take her change. Odd for a bazaar shopper." She turned to greet another customer, leaving Miss Marple to ponder. The green-scarfed woman again. Her shadow seemed to trail the gloves like a ghost. Miss Marple drifted toward the cider stall, her eyes on the dark-coated figure. It was a woman, her face half hidden by a green scarf, her hands bare, but clutching a small bundle of wool. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, then slipped into the crowd, heading toward the churchyard. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her steps soft on the grass. The churchyard was quieter, its gravestones casting long shadows in the fading light. The woman paused near an old yew tree, her back to Miss Marple, and knelt as if adjusting her scarf. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a glint. Something small, metallic, dropped into the grass. The woman stood abruptly and hurried away, disappearing beyond the church. Miss Marple waited a moment, then approached the spot. There, half buried in the damp earth, was a tiny silver button, etched with a faint rose. It matched the glove's embroidery too closely to be chance. She slipped the button into her pocket, her mind racing. The gloves, the crest, the green-scarfed woman. They were pieces of a puzzle, each revealing a whisper of truth. The button suggested carelessness, or perhaps a deliberate trail. Was the woman fleeing something, or leaving clues for someone to follow? As she returned to the bazaar, the crowd's laughter felt distant. The gloves, silent in her handbag, seemed heavier now, their woolen whispers urging her onward. Tomorrow she would search the parish records at the vicarage, seeking traces of the Haverfords or their connections. But tonight, the button and the woman's fleeting presence were enough to sharpen her resolve. In St. Mary Mead, even a bazaar's warmth could hide a confession waiting to be heard. Chapter 7. The Grip of Memory. The morning was crisp, with a thin frost dusting the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple sat by her sitting-room window, the gloves laid out on the table before her, their worn fingertips catching the pale light. The silver button from the churchyard, now tucked in a small envelope, rested beside them, its rose etching a quiet echo of the glove's embroidery. Each clue tightened the threads of the mystery, but last night's discovery had stirred something deeper, a memory, faint but insistent, of a case from decades past. She sipped her tea, her eyes distant. The glove's scuffed fingertips, worn as if their owner had gripped something fiercely, reminded her of a scandal in the 1890s, when she was still a young woman. A theft at the old Haverford Manor, whispers of a servant's betrayal, and a pair of gloves found in the wrong hands, details that had faded but now resurfaced like ripples in a pond. The Haverford crest, the missing will, the nervous woman with the green scarf. Could they be tied to that long-ago crime? Determined to test the memory, Miss Marple decided to visit Mrs. Bantry, an old friend whose memory for village gossip rivalled her own. Mrs. Bantry lived at Gossington Hall, a short walk from the village centre. Wrapping the gloves and button in her handbag, Miss Marple set out, her shawl drawn tight against the chill. Gossington Hall was grand but welcoming, its halls warmed by a roaring fire. Mrs. Bantry, a robust woman with a penchant for dramatic tales, greeted Miss Marple with a delighted clap. "Jane, you old sleuth! What brings you here? Not another murder, I hope?" Miss Marple smiled, settling into a plush armchair. "Not quite, Dolly, but I've stumbled on something curious. A pair of gloves, not mine, with a Haverford crest embroidered on them. They've stirred a memory, and I thought you might recall a story from years ago." A theft at the Haverford Manor, perhaps? Mrs. Bantry's eyes lit up. Her love of intrigue ignited. The Haverfords! Oh, that takes me back. Let me think. Yes, there was a fuss, wasn't there? Mid-90s, I'd say. A necklace went missing. Sapphires, gaudy thing. They blamed a maid, poor girl, but she swore she was innocent. Found a pair of gloves in her room, though. Didn't belong to her. Everyone said she'd stolen them too, to cover her tracks. Miss Marple leaned forward, her teacup forgotten. Gloves, you say? What became of the maid? Dismissed. I'm afraid, Mrs. Bantry said, her tone softening. No proof, but the Haverfords were furious. The necklace never turned up, and then the manor burned a few years later. Tragic, really. Clara Haverford, the daughter, was heartbroken. She left soon after. Miss Marple's fingers brushed her handbag where the gloves lay. And the gloves? Were they described? Mrs. Bantry frowned, tapping her chin. Leather, I think. Fine ones, not a maid's. Someone said they had embroidery. Flowers, maybe. But it was all hushed up. The Haverfords didn't like scandal. She paused, eyeing Miss Marple shrewdly. You think your gloves are connected, don't you? Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her voice mild. They've a crest and a stain, and they've turned up in my knitting basket of all places. It's as if they're asking to be noticed. Mrs. Bantry laughed, but her eyes were keen. You and your mysteries, Jane. If anyone can unravel it, it's you. Want me to dig through my old diaries? I might have notes from those days. That would be splendid, Miss Marple said, rising. And if you hear of a woman in a green scarf passing through, do let me know. She's part of this, I think. She walked back to the village, the frost crunching underfoot. Miss Marple felt the past and present converging. The glove's grip, on memory, on truth, was tightening. The Haverford theft, the missing necklace, the disgraced maid, they formed a shadow that matched the glove's worn edges. Tomorrow she would visit the vicarage to search the parish records, seeking Clara Haverford's trail or the maid's fate. For now, the gloves and their silver button held her steady, their silent story pulling her deeper into the heart of St. Mary Mead's secrets. Chapter 8. Tangled in the thread, the morning sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, as Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table. The gloves spread before her like a map of secrets. The silver button from the churchyard and the Haverford crest had tightened the mystery's weave, but a new discovery had sharpened her focus. Last night, while examining the gloves under a magnifying glass, she'd found a tiny key, no larger than a thimble, sewn into the lining of the left glove. Its brass surface was tarnished, but its presence was deliberate, a hidden thread in the glove's intricate pattern. Miss Marple turned the key in her fingers, her mind racing. A key suggested a lock, a box, a drawer, a door, and its concealment hinted at something worth protecting. The gloves, she realized, were not merely a clue, but a vessel, carrying secrets across time. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was young Lucy from the vicarage, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Miss Marple, I'm so sorry to barge in," Lucy said, twisting her hands. "It's about Tom Wheeler, the grocer's boy. He's gone. Left last night, they say, without a word. His mother's in a state." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her voice remained gentle. "Gone? That's sudden. Did he say anything to you, Lucy? You two are friendly, aren't you?" Lucy flushed, her fingers knotting tighter. Not really, just he was odd lately. Nervous, like he was watching for someone. Yesterday, at the bazaar, I saw him near the churchyard, talking to a woman. She had a green scarf, and he looked scared. Then he was gone by morning. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but she kept her tone calm. A green scarf, you say? Did you hear what they said? No, I was too far, Lucy admitted. But Tom dropped something. A cloth, maybe, and she picked it up. Then he ran off. I thought it was nothing, but now he's vanished, and I'm worried. Thank you, Lucy, Miss Marple said, patting her hand. You've done right to tell me. Go help Tom's mother, and let me know if you hear more. As Lucy left, Miss Marple returned to the gloves, her fingers brushing the hidden key. Tom's disappearance, his encounter with the green-scarfed woman, and the glove's secrets were no coincidence. The key, she suspected, unlocked more than a physical lock. It opened a door to the Haverford mystery, perhaps tied to the missing will or the stolen necklace Mrs. Bantry had recalled. Determined to follow the thread, Miss Marple recalled a small, locked box in the vicarage's storage, mentioned once by Mrs. Price. It had been donated years ago, unopened, its key lost, or so they thought. She donned her coat, slipped the gloves and key into her handbag, and set out for the vicarage, her steps brisk despite the chill. The vicarage was quiet, its garden dappled with frost. Mrs. Price welcomed her, though her eyes were tired likely from the bazaar's aftermath. Miss Marple, what a surprise! Come for tea? Perhaps later, Miss Marple said, smiling. I was wondering about that old box in your storage, the one with no key. Might I see it? I've a notion it could hold something historical. Mrs. Price hesitated, then nodded. It's in the attic, gathering dust. I'll fetch it, but it's locked tight. Been that way since it came from the Haverford estate after the fire. Miss Marple's heart skipped, but she kept her expression mild. Mrs. Price returned with a small iron-bound box, its surface pitted with age. A rose crest, faint but unmistakable, was etched into the lid. Miss Marple drew the key from her handbag, her fingers steady. It slid into the lock with a soft click, and the lid creaked open. Inside was a bundle of letters, their edges brittle, and a single sapphire earring, glinting like a frozen tear. Miss Marple's breath caught. The necklace, or part of it, tied to the Haverford theft. The letters, she suspected, held the truth of that long-ago scandal, and perhaps the green-scarfed woman's role in its revival. As Mrs. Price gasped, Miss Marple closed the box, her mind alight. Tom's flight, the key, the gloves, they were tangled in a thread that led to danger. She would read the letters tonight, but first she needed to find out where Tom had gone, and what he feared. The gloves with their hidden key had unlocked a past that refused to stay buried, and St. Mary Mead's quiet surface was beginning to fray. Chapter 9. The Scent of Secrets. The evening shadows stretched long across Miss Marple's sitting room, where a single lamp cast a warm glow over the small iron-bound box from the vicarage. The gloves, their hidden key now a proven link to the Apne, Haverford legacy, lay beside it, their faint rose embroidery seeming to pulse with secrets. The sapphire earring and brittle letters inside the box had confirmed a connection to the old theft. But Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on a subtler clue. A faint perfume clinging to the gloves, floral yet sharp, like jasmine laced with something bitter. It was no ordinary scent, and she suspected it held the key to the green-scarfed woman's identity. Tom Wheeler's sudden disappearance weighed heavily on her. His nervous encounter with the woman at the bazaar, as Lucy had described, suggested he knew something, or had seen something, he wasn't meant to. The perfume, Miss Marple decided, was her next thread. She recalled a perfumer's shop in Much Benham, a nearby town known for custom blends. If anyone could identify the glove's scent, it was Madame Elise, the shop's eccentric proprietress. The next morning, Miss Marple took the early bus to Much Benham, the gloves carefully wrapped in her handbag. The perfumer's shop was a narrow, fragrant haven, its shelves lined with glass vials and rosewood boxes. Madame Elise, a woman with sharp eyes and a cloud of silver hair, greeted her with a curious smile. "Miss Marple, what a delight," Madame Elise said, her accent a soft blend of French and English. "You seek a scent, I presume? Something to match your charm?" Miss Marple chuckled, setting the gloves on the counter. "Not quite, madame. I need your nose for something unusual. These gloves carry a perfume I can't place. Jasmine, perhaps, with a bitter note. Can you tell me about it?" Madame Elise's smile faded as she lifted the gloves, her fingers tracing the frayed leather. She brought them to her nose, inhaling deeply, then frowned. "Jasmine, yes, but with vetiver and a touch of myrrh. A custom blend, one of mine. Rare, because it's costly." She set the gloves down, her eyes narrowing. "I made it for a woman last month. She was particular, insisted on discretion." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. "Particular, you say? Did she give a name? Or perhaps a description?" Madame Elise hesitated, glancing at the shop's door as if expecting an interruption. No name, but she was nervous. Wore a dark green scarf, kept it tight around her face. Said the perfume was for a gift, but I didn't believe her. She paid in cash, more than needed, and left quickly. Her hands shook when she took the vial. "A green scarf," Miss Marple echoed, the pieces aligning. "Did she mention where she was from, or why she needed such a scent?" "Nothing specific," Madame Elise said, her tone cautious. "But she asked about blending scents to mask others. Said she worked with chemicals, needed something strong. I thought it odd, but customers have their quirks." She paused, then added, "She came back once a week ago, bought another vial, looked even more on edge." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The green-scarfed woman, with her custom perfume, was no fleeting visitor. Her connection to the gloves, the Haverford box, and now Tom's disappearance suggested a deeper purpose, perhaps tied to the letters or the sapphire earring. The mention of chemicals was a new thread, hinting at a profession or a cover for something more sinister. "Thank you, Madame Elise," Miss Marple said, slipping the gloves back into her handbag. "You've been most helpful. If she returns, might you let me know? Discreetly, of course." Madame Elise's eyes gleamed with intrigue. "For you, Miss Marple, I'll keep watch, but be careful. That woman, she carries trouble." As Miss Marple stepped back into Much Benham's bustling streets, the glove's scent lingered in her thoughts. The green-scarfed woman was circling St. Mary Mead, her perfume a trail of secrets. The letters from the box which Miss Marple planned to read tonight might reveal her motives, or her connection to the Haverfords. But Tom's absence gnawed at her. Had he stumbled onto the woman's secret, or was he part of it? The bus ride home was quiet, the countryside rolling past in a blur of gold and green. Miss Marple clutched her handbag, the gloves and their bitter jasmine scent, a reminder that the truth, like perfume, could mask as much as it revealed. Tonight, the letters would speak. Tomorrow she would search for Tom, and the woman whose scent clung to St. Mary Mead's shadows. Chapter 10. Beneath the Surface. The fire in Miss Marple's sitting room crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the iron-bound box from the vicarage. The gloves, their jasmine and myrrh scent, now a confirmed link to the green-scarfed woman, lay beside the box, their frayed edges a testament to their journey. Last night, Miss Marple had read the brittle letters within the box, their faded ink revealing fragments of the Haverford scandal. Accusations against the maid, hints of a hidden affair, and a cryptic reference to a safeguard entrusted to Clara Haverford. But a new discovery had sharpened her focus. This morning, while re-examining the gloves, she'd found a hidden seam in the lining, concealing a scrap of paper with a hurried, scratched message. Cottage by the Ridge, midnight, 3rd. Today was the 3rd. The message, coupled with Tom Wheeler's disappearance and the green-scarfed woman's trail, pointed to a rendezvous, one Miss Marple intended to observe. The cottage by the Ridge, a crumbling remnant near the old Haverford Manor ruins, was isolated, its windows dark for years. If the green-scarfed woman was meeting someone there, it could unlock the glove's final secrets, or expose a danger tied to the sapphire earring and the missing necklace. Miss Marple donned her darkest shawl, slipping the gloves and the silver button into her handbag. She left her cottage under a moonless sky, her steps silent on the frost-kissed path to the ridge. The village slept, its lights dim, but her senses were alert, attuned to every rustle in the hedgerows. The cottage loomed, ahead, its stone walls half swallowed by ivy, its door ajar. A faint glow flickered within, too weak for a lamp, perhaps a candle. She crept closer, crouching behind a gnarled oak. Voices drifted from the cottage, low and tense. One was a woman's, sharp with urgency. The other, a young man's, laced with fear. Miss Marple's heart sank. Tom Wheeler. She strained to listen, her breath shallow. "You shouldn't have come back," the woman hissed. "You saw too much, and now they're asking questions." "I didn't tell anyone," Tom stammered. "I swear, I just found the earring in the shop, like you said. I didn't know it was hers." "Keep your voice down," the woman snapped. "If she finds out, we're both finished. The gloves were a mistake, too traceable. I should have burned them." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her handbag. The green-scarfed woman, then, and Tom, entangled in her scheme. The mention of the earring, likely the sapphire from the box, suggested a theft resurfacing. But who was she? Clara Haverford, or another figure from the past? The candlelight shifted, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse through the cracked window. The woman, her green scarf loose around her shoulders, held a small parcel, her hands gloved, not in leather, but in coarse wool. Tom, pale and dishevelled, stood against the wall, his eyes darting toward the door. The woman's face was partially visible, her features sharp, her hair streaked with grey. Not Clara, Miss Marple thought, but someone who knew the Haverford secrets. A twig snapped under Miss Marple's foot, and the voices stopped. The woman whirled, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Someone's here," she whispered, dousing the candle. Tom bolted for the door, but she grabbed his arm, her grip fierce. Miss Marple retreated, her heart pounding, and slipped into the shadows of a nearby thicket. Footsteps crunched, then faded as the woman and Tom fled in opposite directions, waited, counting to 100 before approaching the cottage. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and myrrh. On the floor, dropped in haste, was a single letter, its seal broken, addressed to C. Tate, Clara Haverford's married name. Miss Marple pocketed the letter, her mind alight. The green-scarfed woman was no mere thief. She was a guardian, or a predator, of the Haverford legacy. Tom's involvement, likely accidental, had made him a liability. The gloves, with their hidden message, had led Miss Marple to this moment, but the letter in her pocket promised a deeper truth. As she made her way home, the ridge silent behind her, Miss Marple felt the weight of the glove's secrets. Tomorrow she would read the letter and trace its origins, perhaps to London, where Clara Tate had vanished. For now, the cottage's shadows clung to her, a reminder that beneath St. Mary Mead's surface, the past was stirring, and the gloves were its voice. Chapter 11. The Weight of Silence. The morning light filtered through Miss Marple's lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across her sitting-room table. The gloves, their hidden message now a proven guide, lay beside the letter she'd found in the cottage, its broken seal bearing the faint rose crest of the Haverfords. The letter, addressed to Clara Tate, was brief but chilling, a warning to keep the safeguard hidden or risk exposure. It was signed only with an initial, E, and dated a month prior. The green-scarfed woman, Tom Wheeler's fear, and the sapphire earring all pointed to a secret Clara had carried from St. Mary Mead, one the gloves had unwittingly exposed. Miss Marple's encounter at the cottage had left her certain. The green-scarfed woman was orchestrating something, and Tom was caught in her web. His disappearance, and the woman's mention of she, suggested a third player, perhaps Clara herself, or someone tied to the Haverford legacy. To draw out the truth, Miss Marple decided to host a gathering at her cottage, inviting those whose reactions to the gloves might betray their knowledge. Mrs. Clement, Mrs. Finch, Lucy, Mr. Pye, and Mrs. Price. The gloves, displayed openly, would be her bait. The gathering was set for late afternoon, the table laid with tea and scones, the room warmed by a crackling fire. Miss Marple placed the gloves prominently on a side table, their frayed leather and rose embroidery catching the light. As her guests arrived, their chatter filled the air, but their eyes betrayed unease, darting to the gloves like moths to a flame. "Such a cosy afternoon, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price said, her smile tight as she sipped her tea. "Though those gloves look out of place among your lovely things." "Oh, they're a curiosity," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "Found them in my knitting basket. Of all places, they've a Haverford crest, I believe. Quite a story, don't you think?" Mrs. Clement's teacup rattled against its saucer, her handkerchief twisting in her lap. "Haverford? That's old history. Why bring it up now?" "History has a way of lingering," Miss Marple replied, her eyes gentle but piercing. "These gloves with their stain and embroidery seem to want attention. I wonder if they belong to someone here, or someone who's been through St. Mary Mead recently." Mrs. Finch, silent until now, shifted in her chair, her fingers gripping her purse. "They're just gloves," she said sharply. "People lose things. No need to make a fuss." Mr. Pye, lounging with his usual polish, leaned forward, his smile thin. "But Miss Marple loves a fuss, doesn't she? I'd wager those gloves have a tail, perhaps tied to that nervous woman at the bazaar. Green scarf, wasn't it, Lucy?" Lucy flushed, her hands trembling. I only saw her with Tom, that's all. I don't know about gloves." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, towards the window. The room grew heavy, the fires crackle, the only sound. Miss Marple watched each face. Mrs. Clement's pallor, Mrs. Finch's clenched jaw, Mr. Pye's calculated calm, Lucy's fear, Mrs. Price's forced cheer. The gloves, silent yet commanding, had stirred a ripple of guilt. Or recognition. "Tom Wheeler's gone missing," Miss Marple said softly, her words cutting through the silence. "And these gloves, I think, know why. If anyone here has seen them before, or the woman who wore them, I'd be grateful for a word. Privately, if you prefer." Mrs. Finch stood abruptly, her purse clutched to her chest. "I've a shop to mind," she muttered, and left without a backward glance. Mrs. Clement followed soon after, murmuring about post-office duties. Mr. Pye lingered, his eyes on the gloves, but said nothing. Lucy and Mrs. Price stayed, their unease palpable, but offered no confessions. As the guests departed, Miss Marple stood at her door, the village green quiet under a grey sky. Mrs. Finch's haste and Mrs. Clement's nerves were telling, but Lucy's fear worried her most. The girl knew something, perhaps about Tom's encounter with the green-scarfed woman. The gloves, now back in their paper bag, had done their work, exposing cracks in St. Mary Mead's calm. Tonight, Miss Marple would reread the letter, searching for clues to E or the safeguard. Tomorrow, she would speak to Lucy alone, gently coaxing her secrets. The gloves' weight, like the silence they'd provoked, was growing heavier, and Miss Marple sensed the mystery's heart was near, but with it a danger that could unravel more than threads. Chapter 12. Unravelled Truths. The village hall of St. Mary Mead buzzed with tension, its long oak table surrounded by familiar faces, each drawn there by Miss Marple's carefully worded invitation. The gloves, their secrets now a tapestry of clues, rested in her handbag, but their final revelation, a concealed photograph found stitched into the lining last night, lay on the table, its faded image a silent accusation. The photograph showed a young Clara Haverford, her arm linked with a woman whose sharp features matched the green-scarfed stranger. On the back, in trembling script, were the words, "Eleanor, keep it safe." Miss Marple had pieced together the threads, the Haverford theft, the missing necklace, the letters, the sapphire earring, Tom Wheeler's flight, and the green-scarfed woman, now likely Eleanor, Clara's confidant. The safeguard mentioned in the letter was the necklace, hidden by Clara to protect a family secret. An affair, perhaps, or an illegitimate heir. Eleanor, tasked with guarding it, had returned to St. Mary Mead, her actions driven by fear or greed. Tom, stumbling upon the earring, had become a threat, and the gloves left in Miss Marple's basket were either a mistake or a desperate plea. The hall was quiet, save for the ticking of a clock. Mrs. Clement, Mrs. Finch, Lucy, Mr. Pye, and Mrs. Price sat stiffly, their eyes flickering between Miss Marple and the photograph. Tom Wheeler, found that morning hiding in a barn, stood near the door, his face pale but resolute, escorted by the local constable at Miss Marple's request. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "These gloves have led us here, through a maze of secrets tied to the Haverfords. This photograph, hidden within them, names Eleanor. A woman I believe has been among us, wearing a green scarf." Mrs. Finch's hands clenched, her knuckles white. "This is nonsense," she snapped. "Old photos mean nothing. Why drag us into it?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her gaze was piercing. "Because the gloves were no accident. They were left in my basket, perhaps by mistake, perhaps as a cry for help. Eleanor, I think, is protecting or exploiting a Haverford secret. Tom, you saw her, didn't you?" Tom shifted, his voice low. I found the earring in Mr. Pye's shop, in a crate. She, the woman with the scarf, told me to keep quiet, said it was dangerous. I didn't know what it meant, but she scared me. I ran." Mr. Pye's smile was tight. "My shop has many trinkets, Miss Marple. I can't account for everyone. If this woman was there, I didn't see her." Miss Marple nodded, turning to Mrs. Clement. "You saw her too, at the post office, posting a parcel. And Mrs. Finch, your locked drawer holds patterns. Perhaps one for rose embroidery, like the gloves?" Mrs. Finch stood, her face flushed. "I've had enough. I don't know any Eleanor." But as she moved, a small vial fell from her purse, rolling across the floor. The scent of jasmine and myrrh filled the air. Lucy gasped, and Mrs. Clement's handkerchief fell from her trembling hands. Miss Marple picked up the vial, her expression serene. "This perfume, custom-made in much Benham, belongs to the green-scarfed woman. Mrs. Finch, you've been nervous since I showed you the gloves. You knew Eleanor, didn't you?" Mrs. Finch sank back into her chair, her defiance crumbling. She came to me months ago," she whispered. "Said she was Clara's cousin, Eleanor Tate. Needed embroidery done special, for old times' sake. I didn't ask questions. She paid well, but she was scared. Kept saying someone was after her." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And the gloves? You made them, or repaired them, and she left them behind?" Mrs. Finch nodded, tears brimming. "She dropped them at my shop. I meant to return them, but I was afraid. She talked about a necklace, said it could ruin her. I put them in your basket, Miss Marple, hoping you'd figure it out. I'm sorry." The room exhaled, the truth unravelling like a pulled thread. Eleanor Tate, Clara's cousin, had guarded the necklace, perhaps intending to sell it or blackmail someone tied to the Haverford affair. The gloves, with their photograph and key, were her insurance, accidentally left behind. Tom's discovery of the earring had panicked her, driving her to silence him with threats. Miss Marple turned to the constable. "Eleanor may still be near. The cottage by the ridge or the train station. She's likely fleeing. Find her, but be gentle. She's frightened, not evil." As the constable left with Tom, the others dispersed, their faces heavy with relief and shame. Miss Marple gathered the gloves and photograph, her heart heavy. The Haverford secret was exposed, but Eleanor's fate and Clara's remained uncertain. The gloves had spoken, but their cost was a village shaken, its trust frayed. Chapter 13. The Gloves Laid Bare. The late afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden hush, its quiet streets a stark contrast to the storm of revelations that had swept through the village hall the day before. Miss Marple sat in her sitting room, the gloves folded neatly on the table before her, their frayed leather and rose embroidery now at rest. The iron-bound box, the sapphire earring, the photograph, and the letters were tucked away, their secrets exposed. Yet the weight of the mystery lingered, like a shadow that refused to fade. Eleanor Tate had been found that morning, apprehended at Much Benham's train station, her green scarf clutched in her hands. She had confessed to the constable, her voice broken by fear and regret. As Clara Haverford's cousin, she had been entrusted with the sapphire necklace, a safeguard to protect Clara's reputation after an affair with a married man, O'Day, scandal that had led to the theft accusation against the maid and the Haverford family's downfall. Eleanor, struggling with debt, had planned to sell the necklace, using the gloves to carry proof of its provenance. But fear of exposure and Tom Wheeler's accidental discovery of the earring had driven her to desperation, leaving the gloves in Mrs. Finch's shop and later Miss Marple's basket. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes on the gloves. Their journey from Clara's hands to Eleanor's, through Mrs. Finch's needle and into her own knitting basket, had unravelled a tapestry of greed, loyalty, and shame. Eleanor's arrest was a resolution, but not a triumph. Clara, long dead in London, had never returned to St. Mary Mead, her legacy a burden Eleanor could not bear. Tom, shaken but safe, had resumed his work at the grocer's, his innocence a small light in the village's gloom. The village itself was quieter now, its residents chastened by their roles in the drama. Mrs. Finch had unlocked her drawer, revealing patterns that matched the gloves' embroidery. Her apology to Miss Marple, tearful but sincere. Mrs. Clement, her nerves steadied, had resumed her post-office duties, though her glances were wary. Lucy, freed from her fear, had confided in Miss Marple about Tom's panicked whispers. Her trust in the old sleuth deepened. Mr. Pye, ever elusive, had offered a vague apology for his shop's role, his charm intact, but his credibility dented. Miss Marple rose, crossing to the window. The village green was empty, the autumn leaves swirling in a gentle breeze. The gloves, she thought, had covered more than cold hands. They had shielded a family's shame, a cousin's desperation, a village's complicity. Their frayed edges, their stain, their hidden key and photograph had spoken truths no one wanted to hear. Yet in their silence they had trusted her to listen. She placed the gloves in a small box, alongside the silver button and the letter to Clara. They would stay there, a reminder of St. Mary Mead's hidden depths. Eleanor's fate, likely a lenient sentence given her confession, would be decided in court. But Miss Marple's work was done. The Haverford secret was laid bare, its shadows dispelled. As she returned to her knitting, her needles clicking, softly, a new question stirred. A stranger had been seen near the vicarage, asking about old parish records. It was nothing, perhaps. A genealogist, a historian. But Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her mind already tracing the edges of a fresh mystery. The gloves were at rest, but St. Mary Mead, she knew, would never stay silent for long.